Theology of Suffering by Serena Grant. What is on the agenda? We are going to talk about the introduction, the objectives, the definition of suffering, explanation of theology of suffering, and then summary, and then some things to think about, and finally resources. So what are our objectives? The first objective is to understand the definition of suffering. The next objective is to understand the definition of theology. And then the third objective is breaking down theology of suffering as a whole. And finally, we are going to review the application to Christian counseling. Why is theology of suffering important for our work as counselors, especially in the Christian field? So, what is suffering? To understand the theology of suffering, we need to break down the words theology of suffering. So, what does suffering mean? Kahn and Steeves define suffering as an individual's experience of threat to self and is a meaning given to events such as pain or loss. I am sure every single one of us can recall a time that they have experienced suffering. Suffering can look different for everybody, and what they describe suffering experience as. It becomes important for counselors to understand that suffering does not look the same for everyone. But it is also important to understand that what we may consider not to be a suffering experience could be someone else's suffering experience. And then more so, what we consider to be a joy in our life will be considered someone else's suffering, and vice versa. So suffering is something that everyone is dealing with. We don't know what it looks like for everybody. And our jobs as counselors could be to uncover what it is that person is suffering and just what could be the thing to get them out of that suffering, or more so, as we'll talk about later, living in that suffering. So the name of this assignment is Personal Integration Presentation. I find it important to talk about the personal part of understanding the theology of suffering. Like I stated before, everyone has had their own version of suffering. But the thing about suffering is that most people feel that they travel through their suffering journey alone. As the definition discusses previously, that suffering is a term that we have generated to express great grief and pain. I have discussed my own struggles before during our interactive assessments. However, I do want to share my own personal suffering that I feel has had a great impact on my life. I grew up in a confusingly rough childhood. From an outside perspective, it may not have seemed that it was a rough childhood. In fact, to most of my cousins who felt as if they might have had it harder than us, and like I said, we do not know everybody's suffering and what it looks like. I'm sure they have their own experiences and what that looked like for them. But because of that, it felt, from the outside looking in, we did look like a great family, and that I had a great childhood. However, behind the closed doors, my childhood suffering started. So my father would be the reason because of this. And I, of course, was a child, so I do not know the full extent of why it happened or what happened. All I knew as a child was that it should not have been happening. And my personal suffering journey allowed me to see that suffering has its good moments and its bad moments. And I had to learn that I was not alone in this suffering. That it was part of God's plan for me. What I don't exactly know how it is going to play out, but I know it's playing out in my life because He has gotten me to this point where I am in counseling and my journey is still continuing. And I do not think that personal suffering is something to be ashamed of. It is something to be owned. It is a part of who you grow into being and it can define your life, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's something you learn, and something that we will talk about later on that God plays a part in. He has a plan for our suffering, and I don't think there's anything that we go through that isn't a part of that plan. However, the important part to gather from personal suffering is to own it, not to be ashamed of it, but rather work through it, work with it during your journey. So the next part that we need to understand is the word theology. And this one's a little easier to understand because it is more commonly known, especially in our field of Christian counseling. But theology is the study of religious belief from a religious perspective. Badham in 1996 explained that theology tends to fall into two categories for people: those that want to move into a fuller understanding of faith, and those who want to understand what it is that Christians believe. In our context, we are working to understand how suffering is related in a counseling setting. So, utilizing previous definitions, theology of suffering can be understood as the study of looking at suffering from a religious perspective. So what does suffering from a religious perspective look like? Most Christians understand suffering as the act of what Jesus went through for our sins. Jesus went through absolute torture and terror to save us from our sins, which we look at more closely in Revelations during the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And most people know about this, which is taught more heavily during Christmas time. But this act of suffering that Jesus went through was for our benefit. Therefore, this idea of suffering can put a huge pressure on what qualifies as suffering. We are told to give our sufferings and worries to Christ, and that He will stand by us throughout our journey. I do think that this makes it harder for Christians to admit that they are suffering in their life. I imagine it feels that way because of the thought, who am I to complain about my troubles? It can leave people feeling that they are alone in their journey, where the very definition of suffering is the description of the feelings of being alone and going through grief. So in that feeling that, why would I complain about my suffering or my troubles, those feelings of great negative feelings, is in itself the very definition of what it means to be suffering. So the idea behind theology of suffering is to understand that we are not alone as much as we think we are, but that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, which is the greatest act of suffering that we know of as Christians. And for us to look at suffering from a theological point of view means to understand that suffering is not always a bad thing. Like I've discussed before, suffering can be something that makes you more appreciative of what comes after, and that there could be an after, as evident through Jesus' sacrifice. He did it for the greater good. And there not necessarily always has to be a lesson through suffering, but rather there's a purpose behind it. So what does suffering look like in a counseling context? Nathan McMahon explained lament as a way to express empathy toward clients. Lament is described as a way to be still and process with the client. One thing that people tend to do that Neff and McMahon discuss is that we want to try to fix sadness and grief because it is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable to sit with somebody and not try to make them feel sad. One of the more often examples of this is when you're talking to a friend and they're telling you a sad story, and your immediate thought is to make them laugh, make them feel better. We don't often like to live in this uncomfortableness of sadness and things like that. I know personally I have a hard time talking to people when somebody's died because I have no idea how to relate, because I feel like it is my job to relate to them and to make them feel better when I have no idea how to do that. So Neff McMahon suggests lament, which is just being still and being with the person, being a listening ear rather than somebody trying to fix it. That's not our job. Our job isn't to fix everybody, but rather just being that person to listen to what they are going through. So in the counseling context, what this would look like was just being present with the client. Neff and McMahon describe instances where they've gone through processes with their clients that are going through grief and these intense negative feelings. And their only response is to just sit in silence. To sit in silence and reflect, to take that moment of silence to appreciate the fact that you are able to feel these emotions. That feeling these emotions means that there was something to be missed. There is a loss to be appreciative for, a loss to be remembered, and something to grieve over. It makes you appreciative of the fact that you were able to have such happiness in your life. And that was one of my favorite things in the Neff and McMahon book, when it came to what theology of suffering would look like in a counseling context. So, to go over a little bit of what we talked about, suffering gives meaning to intense negative feelings that come with the events like grief and loss. Theology is a study of religion from a religious perspective, and therefore the theology of suffering is a study of suffering from a religious perspective. We are not alone during suffering. God is with us always. And to continue to summarize, suffering may look different for everybody, and one's joy may be another's suffering. And so it's important to keep that in mind as we go through life, not even just as counselors, but as people, to be understanding and open-minded to the idea, and empathetic to people, to the idea that we do not always know what others are going through. We do not understand the gravity of what they are feeling. And our job as God's people is to just be able to be there for those people, to be the listening ear, to refer them back to God, to show them that relationship that they could have, and to let them know that they are not alone in their journey of suffering. Theology of suffering in a counseling context involves just being present with the client, being present with the person you are talking to, and just being that listening ear. Some things to think about as we close this presentation. How would you plan to address suffering within your counseling session? Personally, I think I definitely would want to follow Nefa McMinn's advice of practicing lament and just being present during the suffering, but rather referring to suffering as something that is more positive, with a more positive outlook, changing that perspective of what it looks like to be in suffering, and to appreciate it for what it is rather than trying to fix it and turn it into something that you just get over. I think suffering definitely is something to take time in and to really grieve what you are feeling, understanding what you are feeling. How has your suffering experience affected you as a counselor, as a person? As I went over a little bit in my personal testimony, my suffering experience caused me to want to come into counseling, to want to understand how people get to the point that they are. And I definitely think this class has helped a lot in that context of, hey, your suffering does not look like what it does for somebody else. To understand that, you know, there probably is more to what I went through than what I understand, and that there is a plan for everything that I am going through, and there's a plan for everyone that is going through everything else. So my experience has allowed me to be more open-minded in that aspect, and to be more attentive to how I am reacting to others in their journeys. Do you think suffering can be resolved without God in the picture? I kind of went back and forth with this question. I don't think that it would be easy to resolve suffering without God in the picture, because God provides that relationship to have someone to lean on. But I do think that other people can join in. It just may take a little bit of a longer process to resolve suffering, if it needs to be resolved. But I definitely think God helps in that aspect to fill that hole of loneliness that comes with suffering. And then these are my resources. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Thank you.